People don't often want to hear this. What we really need to do is to turn towards suffering. Anxiety, distress, confusion, uncertainty, because that is the way through.
My mother had terrible anxiety, and she would lock herself in her room, and her mantra was, "I'm having a breakdown, I'm having a breakdown."
I always feel very torn that parents may be believing that there's a checklist of 20 things for them to do on the perfect parenting checklist that will fix everything.
You just want kids to talk about their feelings all day long. I'm like,
they tell you that?
Yeah.
Don't need new tips. I mean, for Christ's sake, we have a million tips out there. Everyone knows the tips.
Welcome to the Dealing with Feelings webcast. Today, I had the honor and privilege of talking with Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tiwary. Tracy is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Hunter College in New York, which is part of CUNY, where she's also the director of the Emotion Regulation Lab and the author of over 100 scholarly publications. Tracy, in addition, is co-founder of Arcade Therapeutics, where she creates games to support people in having greater mental health. Tracy wrote a book called Future Tense that I just loved, and today's conversation focuses on that book in particular, where we talk about the role of anxiety as being good for us as opposed to bad for us. That's something to consider, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Please share your comments about the episode, and also subscribe to our channel so that you can learn more about how to deal with your feelings. Welcome, Tracy.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be with you.
You too. So, of course, I have to ask you the question of the year. How are you feeling?
It is a Monday morning as we speak.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling, cautiously optimistic about the week.
Yep.
Feeling a little tired, but I had a lovely weekend with my family. So that's giving me, I don't know, I think a little bit of that extra grounding at the same time. So I'm in that nice, energized forward, but anchored in the safe base of the love of my family.
That's good.
If I had to say.
We have, so my partner's family is here, and it's his brother with his wife and their kids, and I'm glad that we have this space now to host them, but it's energy that I'm not used to. So
yes,
I'm excited to be locked in my office downstairs right now, talking to you.
Oh no, don't get me wrong. I've been doing. I love my closed door time. I definitely, we need that for sure.
So this series is about anxiety, and you've spent most of your career unpacking anxiety in creative ways. But before we jump into that, I'm really curious to know, why is that your area of research? Why do you feel so passionately about that?
I do feel passionately about anxiety. I think I feel most passionately about emotions, maybe
Mhm.
like yourself. When I became a psychologist, I actually had been prior to that a musician and a classical musician. I was an oboist of all things, which is very baroque, literally and figuratively. Um, and when I became a psychologist, it was because I fell in love with some kids I was working with. I really think that's what it was. I was working at Dante Cicchetti's research center when he was at University of Rochester. I was at the Eastman School of Music, so I was lucky enough to have this incredible psychological experience available to me at Rochester, where it's a part of. And these kids, he was one of the first people to really study child maltreatment in a scientific way.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I won't go onto a segue of my first job, but my first job as a research assistant was to code the kinds of maltreatment that these kids suffered. And it was both the worst job and the most enlightening job as well. Because what happened is I would be in the basement of Child Protective Services going through our kids' files, having to code so we could scientifically study what they'd experienced, the horrible abuse in many cases. But then I'd have the gift of being able to work with these kids day after day. And I would see that unbelievably, because I knew what they'd gone through. These were children who were bright, brilliant, resilient. And the thing I noticed most about them, the thing I noticed most about them is that their emotions
Mm-hmm.
were both, there were so many challenging emotions that they experienced, but they still had this incredible joy, this
Interesting.
incredible verve and vivacity. And they were resilient in this way that I just couldn't fathom. And that's, I think I fell in love with their resilience, with their beauty, with their, just these incredible human beings, after, especially after what they've been through. And that set me on the track, I think, to study emotions and how they are these double-edged swords,
Mm-hmm.
that they can compromise us, they can challenge us, but they can also be these incredible sources of creativity and strength. And so my whole career from that moment when I was, still a teenager, essentially, as an undergrad, to the present day when I'm no longer a teenager, it was really this love affair, this kind of a curiosity about this double-edged sword of emotions and anxiety for me as I advanced my career and started studying, especially mental health disorders as well as
Mm-hmm.
resilience. Anxiety, I think, is one of those sharpest double-edged swords of
Yeah.
emotion.
All right. So before we jump into your research, I always like to get to know a little bit more, about you. Um, I'm hearing that you were in college studying music and then moved over to psychology or did both.
Yes.
I'm really curious to know, like, what made you just sort of say, I'm going to be a psychologist? Um,
It's weird, right?
yeah.
Um, it both happened, very quickly and little by little and all at once. That was sort of the experience of it. So um, when I was studying music, because the Easton School of Music is part of this university system, I was able to take courses in whatever I wanted. And while I was loving the music and loving I had a remarkable teacher in Dick Kilmer, I just had all these gifts of becoming a musician, but I was just drawn to taking other courses. So I took everything from Sanskrit
Hmm.
to um, Buddhist mysticism and Islamic history to psychology. I just started taking psychology courses, um, and especially as I started volunteering at the Mount Hope Family Center, which was Dante Cicchetti's center at the time, um, I just found I was waking up every morning thinking more about that,
Hmm.
really being just music school can be very tough and and
Yeah.
grueling, and you love music, but you start to get in this mindset of, oh well, the big marker for my success is how many hours I practiced in the practice room that day.
Hmm.
And I started falling out of love with that a little, even though I loved music, and I was just falling in love with this intellectual curiosity. This, a lot of it was probably me research too. I'm a kid who, I had major depressive disorder when I was a kid. I struggled, and I sort of found that my way out of that was thinking, was discovering my inner life, including spirituality and meditation. And so I think psychology represented to me this sort of technology of consciousness.
Hmm.
It was so exciting, and then I saw these kids who were both so vulnerable and so resilient, and I wanted to understand how that happened. So one day, it felt like, but it was a slow brew. I woke up, I just finished my junior year recital um, at conservatory, and I
Hmm.
announced to everyone I'm switching to psychology. And it was a big bombshell. My poor parents, I really didn't prepare, my poor teacher, I didn't prepare anyone for
Hmm.
it. But I think I'd been just slowly working to that. And then I was able to finish my degree pretty much on time because I'd been taking all those side hustle courses,
Hmm.
and then took some time off before going to grad school, and yada yada. The
Yeah.
rest was the path.
So I did not know, we've known each other for a while, but I didn't know about what you mentioned about your childhood and your own diagnosis. Whatever you're comfortable with, I'm just curious to know, how would you describe your own emotional development?
That is a big question.
Yeah, I'm leaving it open ended for you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. um,
Mm.
I think when I think of myself as a teenager, I think of myself as a pretty vulnerable kid. I mean, I was depressed. I had an eating disorder. I struggled, but I also, and I remember a day, and this is a personal mythology, or maybe this is this narrative that these stories we tell of our lives that allow us to make change. But I have this story in my mind, um, in which when I had been depressed for a couple years, um, and anyone who's gone through a major depressive episode knows that your perceptions of the world shift in some fundamental ways, and mine were very sensory
Hmm.
as well. And I remember one afternoon sitting in my room looking out the window at this tree that was outside my window. And I'd sort of grown up with this tree. It's a beautiful big tree, and I used to climb on it. And I realized in just this snap moment that the tree, even though it was summertime, it was in black and white to me. It was gray. It was in grayscale. And I realized that I'd been seeing my whole life in grayscale for a while now.
Hmm.
And it shocked me. It seemed like this was it was almost a violation of what I also believed about um, living life to our fullest. And and I was an artist too, remember, so I was very artistic. My thing was like, you have to throw your heart into the world and create and beauty, and here I was seeing the world in grayscale.
Hmm.
And it was just, I think for me, it was a turning point where things didn't just get better overnight, but I started to really believe that this emotional dullness, this emotional emptiness was not the way I wanted to live. It was
Mhm.
against my values, as well as just that it sucked.
And so, where do you think you got that awareness from? Like that's pretty high level awareness as a teenager to be observing your difficult emotional life and saying this doesn't align with. That's a lot of agency. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I was always an introverted thinker type. I mean, when people were playing on the playground, I was reading books in the corner. I was shy, still am. Um, I was, I became a vegetarian when I was 12 because I read Diet for a Small Planet and realized how horrible the meat industry was. And so I think I was just a very internal person. And
Mhm.
so maybe I had the luck of having that moment. I also was searching. I was raised Catholic, and I've always been a very spiritually oriented person as well. Um, and I had been trying to meditate. I've been searching for. So all this was sort of happening at the same time when I was looking to my inner life as a source of information, as a source of, I felt very helpless and hopeless at that time. So I think I was looking, and I looked inward. And so in that sense, my emotional life was both fraught, but it was also very alive.
Mhm. And what
You
about?
know,
I'm curious to know from you. You know what you observed growing up, and so uh, siblings, no siblings.
I have a younger sister who's
Okay.
6 years younger to me, Katie.
Okay.
And she and I were both close and not close because that age difference was quite, and we're very close now. She's one of my best friends now, and I'm very grateful for my sister. But at the time, but I would do things like force her to listen to, like, I'd read her poetry at night as a bit, like, I made her memorize The Raven of all things. Like, I mean, really? Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, that was probably my goth dark phase, so I'm
Uh-huh.
sure. But
And
I have a
then,
sister. I have two parents. My father passed now, but my mother is alive and well. But I grew up with them. So we had the four people in our family.
and if you were to describe, like, create a title for the movie that would describe the emotional life of your childhood, what would you?
Oh, it was not a happy family life. My parents divorced later, and being Catholic, I think they felt that they needed to stay together for the kids, but that probably was, there are costs and benefits to that.
Mhm.
So it was an emotionally fraught place. I think another reason that I probably retreated inward.
Mhm.
Um, I had, and so I think I looked outside the family for connection. So music was a big connection, both my music training and the arts in general, but also music in the world. And so I was a big music fan. I loved poetry. I loved reading. I was reading the existentialists when I was 14 years old. So I was, so I think that suffering,
Mm-hmm.
um, that blend of suffering drove me to look to other sources for comfort, and I took consolation in those things, and it was a huge gift in that sense.
Oh, thank you for that, for sharing. And so maybe this has a connection, I'm not sure, but you've taken an emotion, a state, a trait. We can get into the details of that in a moment, that we call anxiety, that has many friends like stress and overwhelm and
Yeah.
etc.
Also, hope
Yeah.
and ambition.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll get there. I know. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good. And, I've made a case that's not like everybody else's case, around the productive value of anxiety. And so I'd love for you to just take us through, how you decided or why you decided to go in depth in terms of, your book Future Tense makes it clear that there are benefits to anxiety and that, right now, at least, from other work that's out there in the world, including, the Surgeon General's reports, that we are a society, a world that is, just drowning in anxiety. The perception of anxiety, at least from my standpoint, meaning going to schools and talking with families, is that it is, people are drowning in anxiety. And so to me, the mindset there is that this is a state or a diagnosis for some people that is debilitating. And and so I'm curious, can you take us through your thinking about anxiety as something different?
Yeah. Um, Thank you for that. So I think I'll start very briefly, completely acknowledging that in no way am I discounting the suffering that anxiety causes, nor that there's certainly a crisis of anxiety disorders right now. And I speak a lot at schools as well, and that's a very important starting point when you're talking with parents and
Mhm.
kids who are going through this. But and not a but an and I will say that nothing in my book is contradictive to that, is contradictory to that very real fact and how much we must honor it. So the starting point I take, and this is really, again, I think to my maybe those earliest experiences of thinking of emotion as a double-edged sword intuitively, and then as becoming a psychologist, having the great good luck to study with people like Pamela Cole, who was my graduate school advisor, Joe Campos, who was one of the founders of functional emotion theory, one of the early, really intellectual giants in that area, along with Pamela. And what functional emotional theory teaches us is something actually Darwin knew about 150 years ago when he wrote the third in his trilogy, the third book in his trilogy, laying out evolutionary theory, which was a book completely about emotions. It's called The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. And in it, he argues that just like the ability to, for a lizard to have to camouflage their skin, right, and or for all of the biological and phenotypic traits that get passed down to that through generations because they help ensure the survival of the species, emotions are the same, especially our most difficult emotions like anxiety. And so my whole stance on anxiety is really one of functional emotion theory, which is that um, these difficult emotions um, serve a very important purpose for us. And the emotion of anxiety is distinct from anxiety disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can make that distinction, we will be in a much better place to live well with the inevitability of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And again, to draw on some crusty old, not that Darwin is crusty, but very relevant today, but like him, about even older, 180 years ago, Soren Kierkegaard, you may know, wrote a whole book about anxiety. And there are two favorite quotes I have from that. And one of the quotes to speak to this point is he wrote in Danish, but the English translation is something like, "Whosoever learns to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate."
Mm-hmm.
Now, mind you, the ultimate is not to destroy anxiety or to never be anxious. to
Right.
avoid all anxiety. It is to be anxious in the right way. And so these two intellectual traditions in some way, really, I'm just saying something very similar.
Let's just
And so that's the first point. Yeah.
let's just pause there to make sure we're really clear for everybody, because
Yeah.
we as psychologists get this, I think, intuitively, but not everybody does, who's not trained. And so the anxiety as an experience, as a
Mhm.
momentary, I'm someone who, I have a high startle reflex.
Mhm.
In general, like the
Yeah.
joke in my family is Mark has a fifth-degree black belt, but he's afraid of his own shadow.
That's a good one.
And I mean, they're both true. I don't, and this could be, I guess, the
Yes.
case where,
Yes.
and so, when I'm triggered by something around uncertainty, I get activated, and I can feel the anxiety. My mind goes in certain places. But I've never been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Now, it's possible I could be, but it's not something consistent, in terms of my daily life. And so, can you help us distinguish between when you're referring to momentary or the emotion of anxiety versus, the diagnosis?
Mhm. So, so the emotion of anxiety is, as you say, something that's something we all experience. Even and we can even experience it very frequently and have very a startle reflex that's very high and low threshold and like you. I'm famous for having a low. Actually, I don't startle at all. My kids actually make a game of trying to make me startle, but anyway, which is funny. Um,
Because you're Catholic and I'm Jewish, by the way. So we
I went. Oh, we could go into that. I realized that Catholicism has shaped me in some fundamental ways, but we'll go.
yeah,
That's a different podcast. Maybe we can do that one later. So the emotion of anxiety, right, is it's the feeling we get when, as you said, we look into the uncertain future, right? Anxiety is not fear. It's not certain and present danger like a snake about to bite me. That's fear.
yeah.
Anxiety is all about anxiety. Sorry, uncertainty. Anxiety is all about uncertainty. And it inhabits that space between where we are now and where we want to be. Because uncertainty is not just that the bad thing's going to happen. It's not that I'm nervous about an upcoming test if I'm a kid and I think I can get an F. It's that I'm anxious because I know I could still do well. So it sits in that place where hope is, where persistence is, that space between where we are now and where we want to be. And it feels uncomfortable because we have to sit up and pay attention to this future that doesn't exist.
Hmm.
We have to use our big, giant prefrontal cortices to imagine and run the simulations on this future where I have to work to avert disaster, but still make my dreams come true. That is anxiety. And if we were just focusing on the negative when we were anxious, we would be in despair.
Hmm.
That is not anxiety.
I think
So it is
just
an
let's pause
extremely
there.
uncomfortable emotion, but it's sending us into the future, which is one part of its usefulness.
Let's just pause there for a minute, because that is, unique in terms of the way I hear people talk about anxiety. Most people have the negative connotation, that, and I distinguish it myself from fear and stress. But typically, that space of uncertainty, I think the mindset in general for most people is that it's leaning towards a terrible future as opposed to a future of great possibility. And so that alone, I think, is critically important to what you're saying.
I thank you, and I do think, and this is really why I get up in the morning these days. There are multiple reasons, but that's a big one in my professional life. To share this idea that it's possible to reconsider that this terrifying emotion at times, this emotion that makes you feel that your heart might explode, that you might spiral out of control, that it actually is this incredible ally in that sense. But allies don't just do what you want them to do. You have to negotiate with it.
Hmm.
And I think my arts background helps me a little bit in having wrapped my head around this because, my husband is a Broadway producer, and we're very, very blessed to, be able to speak to and witness so many beautiful, performers on Broadway. And if you speak to them, these folks know about anxiety. They know from anxiety. They know that There's a wonderful, a few wonderful dancers that I've spoken to who have said things to me like, if I'm not throwing up in the bathroom before my big solo, something's off, because that means that you care about the situation. You're only anxious when you care. It means that all of your energy, you're preparing to do something very hard. Sometimes that expresses itself as vomiting, but most of the time, your heart's pumping to send oxygen to your brain,
Mm-hmm.
blood to your muscles. You're preparing to do something hard, not fall apart. So when you combine that bodily reaction with a mindset of possibility, and in the case of a dancer, these incredible Broadway performers, the greatest performers in the world, you can't beat them. When you combine that with that expertise and that work that they've put in, that's when the magic happens. And
Mm-hmm.
that's anxiety.
Okay, so that's your definition, or kind of a good definition of anxiety. Now let's just quickly define, when we see anxiety, in terms of
Yeah,
a mental health condition.
right. And that's super important. So, an anxiety disorder, as you've noted, it's not just diagnosed because you might have frequent or low level anxiety, right? Or even high level anxiety. You diagnose an anxiety disorder when your experiences of it they last too long, right? So that's it's not just a few days, it's like weeks and weeks, months after months. It's too strong. So the intensity levels really, it just takes a lot of energy to manage it all the time. It doesn't fit with the context. So, if you have, I use the example of test anxiety, it's normal and expected to be anxious before a test. And it's probably even good because it means you care about it. But if you're anxious about this little quiz you're going to take in 2 months and it's ruining the time you're trying to spend with your friends, that's out of context. So,
Mm-hmm.
right. So the fit is off. And this is the big diagnostic criterion, of course, that's most crucial. It's called functional impairment if you're diagnosing it with the DSM, or it's that coping with anxiety, the ways that you cope get in the way of you doing the things you want to, need to, love to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually getting in the way of you living a full and happy life. And it's not anxiety that's getting in the way, by the way. It's the way that we're coping with it, and usually that involves avoidance and escape. So now I'm worried about that test. So I'm so worried that I'm staying up all night and I can't pay attention in class. And I'm starting to actually study really poorly. And I'm starting to skip school because my anxiety is so high. And I'm cutting off from all my friends because who could be a form of support to me.
Mm-hmm.
So this avoidance and escape is so rigid that it's blocking my ability to actually go through the anxiety. I'm trying to go around it all the time. And that's also characteristic of an anxiety disorder.
So what is your perspective nowadays? For example, where I work, upwards of 80, 90% of students are saying they have anxiety problems and challenges. And, I want to have empathy because people, we have to, the only way we can get to know people is by what they tell us about themselves in general. But there's a
Correct.
part of me that says this is kind of biologically impossible to
Yes.
have, this level of anxiety that's real anxiety, whatever that means again. And so, do you think we've gotten to a place? And this is I'm like the interviewer who's asking a question that I'm answering. So be careful about this.
No, no, go ahead. I
Like,
want to hear your
it's
answer.
not an open-ended question. Which is my hunch. I'll just say my hunch is that we have a contagion problem in our society. That we've just, we have reports about anxiety. People, because interesting years ago when I did research on this, the number one emotion that was talked about by teachers and students was stress. They all said, I'm stressed. No one says stress anymore. It's one in my Wordles that I show, it's like one big self reported, I'm anxious, 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 anxious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm just curious, like, what has happened that, we're at a
yeah.
place like this?
I agree with you entirely. I even say sometimes anxiety is the new stress because that's exactly right. That's exactly the transformation. We have a placeholder word now that holds all of our distress and suffering,
Uh huh.
and that's anxiety. And so you know there are two things. One is I really did write my book out of this confusion with this very point you're bringing up, because not only has this, it's almost impossible for everyone to have an anxiety disorder, of course, but As rates of anxiety disorders have steadily gone up these past 20 years, do you know what else has gone up? Excellent science, fantastic evidence-based treatment approaches, medication for those who need it. So we have more solutions than ever before, and it is not working. Which brings me to your contamination idea. I think what's starting to happen is that our beliefs about anxiety are making anxiety worse.
Mm.
We're talking more about mental health than ever before, which is good in many ways, but we're talking about it in ways that have become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably familiar with this notion of prevalence inflation that's sort of been making the rounds, especially in the mass, kind of in the media, in the general media. And it's this idea that as we have more awareness of mental health problems, anxiety being top of the list, we're starting to overinterpret every experience of anxiety as problematic.
Yeah.
And anxiety probably underlies most of our life most of the time because it's on the spectrum, everywhere from butterflies in your stomach to full-blown panic, and positive feelings of excitement and anticipation to horrible feelings, right? So anxiety is probably there most of the time. It's sending us into the future, and now we're interpreting it as dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mindset of danger, dysfunction, and brokenness the minute we perceive it. And so we act as if our house is on fire every time we feel anxious, which is the recipe for making anxiety worse. It's that avoidance
Mm-hmm.
that if it becomes a rigid way of coping, can actually, I believe, lead us down that path to anxiety disorders because it's a fundamental characteristic of them.
I was going to ask you this, and you kind of answered it already, which is, I'm in the field of emotional intelligence, social and emotional learning, positive psychology, et cetera. And I wrote a piece a while back around, we've had 35 years, of high quality implementation of social emotional learning programs, and
Yeah.
everyone's talking more and more, about emotions, but yet the world feels like it's getting more psychologically unhealthy. And I
Yeah.
think part of what you're saying is one of the reasons is our belief systems. We've been kind of like almost brainwashed in many ways to see unpleasant emotions as bad, this kind of belief system. Am I
Yeah.
getting you right there?
You're 100% getting me right. And I'd even take it further, which is that I think we have come to believe that suffering is unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not an easy thing to tell people. But I feel that we psychologists, we in the field, have done people a huge disservice because we've convinced them that suffering is unacceptable,
Yeah.
all suffering. And you see this not just emotional suffering, but physical suffering.
Yeah. Just like
And
discomfort.
right, so you see the opioid crisis as perhaps part of this numbing and this escape of suffering. And what I'm telling people in no uncertain terms, unfortunately, I think, because no people don't often want to hear this. What we really need to do is to turn towards suffering,
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, distress, confusion, uncertainty, because that is the way through. And it's a difficult message, but I feel that the turning away has amplified our suffering beyond the boundaries we thought possible.
All right, so now this is your opening. What's the 6-step, 12-step, 10-step program? What do you believe are the like? So for every parent, every educator, that's who I work with a lot. Um, how do we begin to educate them on the things that you're talking about?
Well, I have to start with the notion that I feel that I am part as trying to be part of the solution, like we are, all of us. We are actually in some ways part of the problem, because I think the self-help industry and this kind of the idea industry um, and the wellness industry has become a huge contribution to the suffering of
Mm-hmm.
day-to-day folks and of ourselves, honestly, because we feel that life and ourselves have become problems to solve, broken machines to fix.
Mm-hmm.
And so my first piece of advice to people is to stop reading all those damn books. Even
Yeah.
ours, Mark, especially. I know, no. But yes, actually, if I could write a book that didn't exist,
Right.
right? Follow fewer checklists. Just do less, because what that's all, not only does it put us on this hamster wheel, a feeling that there's some optimized, perfect world and
Hmm.
self to achieve, which we will lose that every single time. But it makes us feel so hopeless. It makes us feel so broken. I think this in parenting, this is a real, I mean, I give parenting talks more than any other kind of talk.
Hmm.
And I always feel very torn that parents may be believing that there's a checklist of 20 things for them to do
Yeah.
on the perfect parenting checklist that will fix everything. And most of the time these days, what I have come to is that I need to tell people to do less, to trust their gut more, and to just do one thing, to find the essential, because I'm interested in turning towards emotions and to find ways in our life to do that. Um, I'm also a parent of two teens, and I can tell you I've been brought to my knees
Hmm.
because my kids have
Right.
gone through ups and
Your
downs.
theories can be challenged quite rapidly at home.
And yeah, and right, and my theories can be challenged, but also you realize that it doesn't matter all this book learning and all these ideas when you're just confronting these real relationships.
Hmm.
But it was only in letting go of some of that that I started to find a way through.
Hmm.
And so my advice for where parents need to start is to know that they already know a lot. It's that they have, and that before they go to a book, go to a community, go to an Uncle Marvin, go
Hmm.
to the wisest person you know, go to your pastor, go to your friend. Don't go to a book first.
Hmm.
Go to your community. And the Surgeon General has actually included this in his advisory about parenting. Which, by the way, everyone's like, "Oh, the Surgeon General says parenting is hazardous to your health." No, he's not saying that.
Hmm.
He's saying they're under pressure, which we are. We are, and it's a we, by the way. I'm not youing anyone right now. It's a
Yeah.
we. So that's the first thing. I'll pause there, but that really is the first thing. I'd love to know what you think of that as well. That's the first thing I'd say.
Yeah. I think, what comes to mind for me as someone who did grow up in a very neurotic way, meaning my mother had terrible anxiety and she would lock herself in her room and her mantra was, I'm having a breakdown. I'm having a breakdown.
Mhm.
And it was very unhealthy because it just made me see that when you have strong emotions that you feel you don't have control over, you disappear or you can't function. And that was
Mhm.
really what I witnessed. Now, I'm blessed that I've spent a significant part of my life, working on these things. Um, and I would say for me, in terms of step one, is going back to our earlier conversation, which is, this whole concept, that people talk about around like, I am not anxiety, like I experience anxiety and
Mhm.
noticing the anxiety and sort
Mhm.
of like, okay, so today I'm feeling a little anxious. Okay, that's just what I'm feeling right now. And tomorrow the sun's going to be bright and I'm going to be hiking. I'm going to feel fabulous. And it's raining this day, you know, and that not attaching so much to it, I think has been very helpful for me. Um,
Yeah.
that it's not like when I was studying mindfulness back in the day with Thich Nhat Hanh, he would say things like, some people think of strong negative emotions as like a toothache, that it's never going to go away. And for
Mhm.
me, like the other day, I had a really rough day. And in that moment, it does feel like a toothache. It just feels like my
Mhm.
life is misery. But then the
Mhm.
next day, I'm out with dinner with friends and I'm like, I have the best life ever.
Mhm.
Wait a minute. You know,
Emotions are not forever.
yeah. And
Yeah,
so I
good
think
point.
like I'm really curious, about the mindset pieces and the belief systems pieces that you talk about, because I really adopted a mindset of observation as
Yeah.
opposed to what's the what I'm getting my point really is that um it's like almost like I say hello to it. Oh, anxiety, you're here today. It's nice to see you.
There's there's a great podcast I was on called Why Hello Anxiety.
Right.
It's a great one. It's a great
And
yeah.
thank you for the information you're providing. And
Yes.
going back to your thing, I really appreciate that you get anxious when, because it is around something you care about.
Yeah.
That is really helpful, actually, in
When
terms
you
of,
yeah, when you say the flip side of anxiety is hope, all of a sudden you're like, "Oh." When you say to yourself, "I'm anxious now because I'm preparing to do something hard that matters to me." Then you're like, "Oh, wait a second."
yeah, it's like you care.
You talked about role modeling too, and having those role models around us is really important.
And so, can we jump into kind of you know, most people, and I want to go back also before that, I agree with you. And we've gotten, as you know, some like people who really push back on the work that we do, saying, that we're coddling kids or that we are, you know, asking kids, for example, people have criticized my work saying things like, you just want kids to talk about their feelings all day long. I'm like,
They tell you that?
yeah. And I'm like, I don't want
Yeah, Mark, that's what you want.
Yeah. Like, no, I want kids to be learning in school and playing sports and hanging out with their friends and doing their, art projects. I don't want them talking about their feelings all day long.
Oh my god.
Um, because I don't think that's healthy. And we know that's not great to be constantly, introspecting
No,
all
it
the time.
becomes rumination, yeah.
Yeah. So can we jump into, strategies?
Mm,
You are talking with a friend, who is just struggling with, they're just feeling anxious, a parent working with their kid.
yeah,
We have the things that we spoke about already, but what are some helpful, like, concrete strategies?
yeah. Um, I use in the book I talk about this as well, and all of my talks now I really elaborate on this because I think this is key. We don't need new tips. I mean, for Christ's sake, I mean, we have a million tips out there. Everyone knows the tips, but the problem is, what do you do in the moment?
Mhm.
And so I've created this framework that's not so different from other things, but it just says it with the three letters, the same letter, the three L's. So it's just a mnemonic. And the three letters that I use are listen, leverage, and let go in that order, which is very important. When I gave a talk last week in a school in Philadelphia, I was so pleased to spend the whole day with the school and share these three L's. Got to talk to the students too, and one of the students apparently I heard later, after hearing the three L's, she went up to one of the teachers and said, "Oh my gosh, this lady, she was talking about anxiety, but I learned that I don't have to be afraid of it. I learned I can do something with it, and I don't have to be afraid of it anymore." And it was literally, it's like, if that's all I ever achieve, that's it. And so what the
Mhm.
three L's are is that when anxiety knocks at your door, the first thing you need to do is to listen to it. And that can mean different things. Now, if we're with our kids, and I think about this a lot because as I said, I have teens and there's lots of feelings that we're all having right now. Um, I think of it when difficult emotions show up, the listening part, as really just getting curious. Um, and what that means is that we're like scientists when we're curious. We're open.
Mhm.
We haven't decided. We're just observing, right? You can have a hypothesis, but any good scientist collects data first, right? So you're not telling kids what they feel. You're open. You're curious, and you're non-judgmental. Now, this is hard because we really get scared when our kids are really upset. We really, the meta anxiety, and we've already kind of alluded to this idea,
Mhm.
that meta anxiety, our anxiety about our kids' anxiety is so intense. I have felt it. I've done wacky things as a result of it that I knew I
Mhm.
shouldn't do, and I did it anyway. I have a whole story about that in my book, like several stories like that. Um, but what we need to do is to be in the basement with our kids is a kind of a phrase I've started to use. And what that means is they're in the basement when they're struggling, right? They might not be able to give words to it yet. That's great, but not yet maybe. And when you're in the basement, you're with their deepest, darkest feelings. You're not trying to turn on the light. The light's broken. You just go down those stairs and you abide with them. And when I tell parents that sometimes that's all you need to do,
Mhm.
you pause on fixing and soothing, do less, not more, but just totally, and they may say, you may say, well, what's going on? Nothing. And then you say, okay, is it okay if I just sit here with you for a little while?
Mhm.
Like, you don't have to say anything. I'm not going to say anything. I promise I won't say anything. and tell me when you want me to go. And we've tried, when I did, with my own kids, when we've done this, when it's been really, really hard moments, and you sit and you wait for them to tell you to go. It's like been 5 minutes, 10 minutes. No one's saying anything. You're not doing anything. 30 minutes will go by and you're still sitting there and you realize, oh, they needed to know that they don't have to be a show pony for me. They
Mm-hmm.
don't have to perform happy. They don't have to fix it even, right? They can just have these emotions. And when you give kids that moment, that listening, they can, that doesn't fix everything, but it helps them get through some of the worst of it. And they start to feel less scared of those emotions so that they can take that next step and figure out what to do with it, which is the leverage.
So what's interesting, obviously our work is like so overlapping that it's kind of crazy. This is related obviously to permission to feel. But
Totally.
also, I don't know if I share with you, but since, writing that, and then I've done research on the characteristics of the Uncle Marvins, the Aunt Medeas, and the top three consistently across cultures. Number one, non-judgmental.
Hmm.
Number two, good listener. Number three, empathic / compassionate. And others come in like warm and supportive, but those are always the top three. Never do we see brilliant problem solver, fixer.
No, no.
But I've been really interested, given that this is related to your work. And so when I give presentations and I share that, um, there's still resistance. Like some people, as a matter of fact, I'm sure you hear this too. Like it's hard for me to be non-judgmental. Like I have to push my kid, right? Like it's like if I'm non-judgmental, that means I'm being like a pushover. And I think they misunderstand what it means to be
Yeah,
non-judgmental.
that's great.
But what's interesting to me is also that two things show up for me in terms of the barriers to parents and others being, non-judgmental, good listeners, empathic. And the first one is people say time. Because what you just said is like you're just literally parking on the seat and just being with, not saying much. Maybe, if something comes out, respond. And people say, I don't have the time for that, which I find really interesting. Like, you don't have time to be with your kids or, be non-judgmental, which is, when you think about it's actually more effortful to like just sit around being judgmental than it is to just be open and
A
not.
lot more, a lot more energy. I sometimes nod off if I'm sitting there.
But the second thing is fear that I
Yeah.
find that the adults, who are raising and teaching kids say, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to be with because if my kid really starts sharing how they're feeling, I'm not going to know what to do about it. And I'm just curious, what do you do with that as, in terms of the adults' fear? It's their meta emotions in many ways. Like I'm afraid of the feelings that might come out or,
This is why I say that our fear of suffering is so fundamental to this. It's like the
yeah.
knot. It's the knot. And I think it's so beautiful that parents felt they could share this with you too, because this is incredible. It makes us all feel incredible. And again, I'm back to us because I
Yeah.
really have felt all these things as I've tried to kind of both take my own advice and see the limits of my advice. And,
Hmm.
you know, um, I think one thing to say to parents when they're afraid that they won't know what to do is that that's not what kids don't need you to know what to do in those moments. That's not the problem set.
Hmm.
The problem set is that to be fully emotionally intelligent human beings, which is so much, again, we really do overlap in so much of what we're thinking about, um, is you need to, well, it's what Kierkegaard said too. The ultimate is to learn to be anxious, be angry, be sad, be happy, be all those feelings in a way that works for you in your life. And the only way, if we deny our kids and ourselves the training grounds to develop that wisdom, and the only training grounds we have are to feel the feelings.
Hmm.
That's the only training ground we have. That not only, and I tell this to parents, not only is it kind of dishonoring your child and what they're capable of, is you are putting them at a huge disadvantage. And when in the moment you feel like you need a solution, you don't. They just need to know that you are with them to figure out a solution.
Mm-hmm.
You are their wing person, you are their scaffolding, you are their support, you are with them 100%. That's actually what they need to know. And then you may not have the right answer and you may not get there for a long time. But if you are that safe base for them, they will internalize that safe base and they will find it in themselves. That's the only way to help children build resilience. And this whole notion of coddling, I just hate that term. People just need to stop using it because it misses so much of this nuance
Mm-hmm.
of what it means. Like, when you're non-judgmental, it doesn't mean you have to accept or agree or advocate. You're just like, this is where you are now, and I am with you. And then now together, we're going to figure out where to go next. And it's not about weakness. It's like coddling. It just has all that baggage that I just think is
Yeah.
just terrible,
Well, I think,
So that's what I think, parents, we have to take some pressure off ourselves too with that in that count.
well, and that's again going back to the research, which shows that no one, I mean, I've done this now, I think I have 20,000 people in this research project, and maybe 3 people out of 20,000 say that person was a fixer. Nobody says that.
Mhm. No.
And I think that it also doesn't help build, the muscle that we all need
Yeah.
to like really sit with these unpleasant feelings. And I think there's power in that, as you're saying, which is that the, reflecting on the feeling, engaging in this is a sign, that I care about this. That means that now I could
Yeah.
maybe put my effort into like studying more or working harder on the art project or
That's the leveraging. That's right. But you have to have that information first. And that's what the listening gives you. Because usually it's a mess of feelings and thoughts, right? Listening, just sitting with it, it lets that information and wisdom rise to the surface. There's that horrible phrase that's been just grabbed by the ultra right about facts don't care about your feelings.
yeah.
Facts absolutely care about your feelings because there's so much wisdom in these feelings. But we've come to despise them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and this notion of anti-fragility, I think, is one that's very helpful for people. This idea that there are things that require challenge to grow stronger, muscles, right? The immune system, right? Resilience is the phoenix rising from the ashes.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-fragility is the hydra. This is Nassim Nicholas Taleb's concept. You cut off one head and two grow in its place. And emotions are anti-fragile. And so when parents start to think of it that way, when kids can start to internalize it, and when parents are modeling that perspective, it really cuts through a lot of these vicious cycles and self-fulfilling prophecies that we
Mm-hmm.
were talking about.
And so for the leveraging piece, I'm curious to know from you just a few additional strategies.
Yeah.
Um,
So a great example of a leveraging is the worry appointment, which you
okay.
might have heard of. Now, this was actually developed by Dr. Tom Borkovic, who I went to, who was a professor when I was at Penn State, the wonderful Dr. Tom Borkovic, who's just a mensch. Talk about a guy and brilliant. And he really is a fundamental figure in the GAD, the generalized anxiety disorder field, where worry is the key symptom. And so what you do with this technique is you schedule worry time. Because the problem with worry is not that we have the worries, it's that when we try to push them away, right, they spiral and they start to intrude. So with a worry appointment, what happens is you're tuning into these worries and then you're choosing to do something with them. So you take 20 to 30 minutes each day, do it for at least a week or so. And don't do it first thing in the morning when you wake up because you just need to get into your day. Don't do it right before bed, but just pick a quiet time and set a timer. Get a journal. And if you have a younger kid, they can even talk to someone out loud. But write down in exquisite, excruciating detail every worry in your head. But it's not like I'm worried about the test, I'm worried about my friends. It's I'm worried that when I go take my math test, I'm going to walk into the room, I'm going to trip over my feet, and I'm going to fall on my face, and I'm going to break my pencil. And then I'm going to sit down, and I won't know how to do that particular type of algorithm, and I'm going to go blank, and I'm going to freeze. So you get the idea.
Mhm.
But so it's the good, the bad, and the ugly, though, because you also might have some good things like, oh, I'm really worried about Francine, and that she's talking behind my back, but I really care about Francine and she's kind of my best friend and I want to repair this relationship. So you
Mm-hmm.
write for 20 or 30 minutes. The first thing you'll notice is that you cannot worry for 30 minutes straight. It's almost impossible. And so you learn that there's an end to worry. The
You get
second thing,
tired of the you get burnt out from the
then you're like, oh, there's an end to it. It will stop. You get burnt out. And also because you're putting it to words, it's becoming concrete, right? And you name it, you tame it. Anything mentionable
yeah.
is manageable. The saintly Mr. Rogers said that. And um, and then so you feel a little better already. Then and then you go away for just a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes if you can. If you can't, it's okay. But when you go away, you come back, you read your list, and you realize that half of it you don't even care about anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's incredible. Then you have these worries in front of you. And this is the leveraging. You figure out, okay, what can I control and what can't I? And the things you can't control right then, you put aside. But the things you can control, all of a sudden you have this superpower that you have something you can do. You know, when my son was born with a congenital heart condition and I knew he had to have open heart surgery as an infant, which he did, and he's fine, he's great, he's
Mm-hmm.
16 now. Um, there were things about that situation I could not control. I could not control that he had a heart condition. But by leaning into these worries and using them as information, I figured out all sorts of steps I could take to get him the right care, to take better care of myself. And it allowed me to really be the best possible parent to my child at that
Mm-hmm.
time.
That's great. I like also that, the controllability thing, I don't think can be talked enough about because I remember, for example, right when the pandemic hit, the it was crazy. Yale shut down. I'm
Mhm.
running for the first time, a team of 40 people on Zoom. Everybody's with their kids. They're freaking out about how they're going to take care of their children while working. I mean, it was all, the stock market
Yeah.
was crashing. It was just sort of a crazy, crazy time. People were dying so rapidly. I'd be sitting there and I'd start having, anxiety. It was all about the uncertainty of what's going to happen with my work, what's going to happen with the schools we're serving, what's going to happen in the stock market, what's going to happen with people's health. And I would take a deep breath and I would say, Mark, you don't run the stock market. You're not the president. You barely understand how it even works. Uh, in truthfully, you're not the president of the university. You're not a trustee of the university. Like you are putting a lot of time
Yeah.
into worrying about things that you have little, like you have nothing, you can't do anything about. Can you just, as we're coming to a close with these things, around that piece, because I think that's a huge piece of
It's a huge piece.
of the where people are right now, right? People are worrying about climate change, which, obviously there's things we can do. People are worrying about politics. People are worrying about school shootings. There's a lot of things that, can make us feel anxiety these days. Um, some of which we have control over, like my anxiety around speaking with you, right? Is something I can like say, Mark, Tracy's going to be great. You're going to be great. It's going to go well. Um, is different than these larger issues.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up because I've had very, very thoughtful, especially young people come up to me after a talk and say, "Hey, but the world's really bad right now." Anxiety makes sense. There's these disparities. There's and all these very valid points about the world, climate. And my answer to that is yes. And the gift of anxiety is that it can drive us to do those things we can control within that, right? Um, and when we, by the way, anxiety is this incredible feedback machine too, because when we take action, anxiety is happy.
Mhm.
Because anxiety isn't just about the fear circuits and the threat circuits, it's about dopamine as well, which makes us goal driven. So dopamine activates in our brain when we're anxious too, because it's about positive goal states.
Mhm.
So that dopamine and all those good, it's this feedback that yes, we're doing something. So we can ride that wave, you know, but but all these overwhelming anxieties, they are real. The only choice we have is to do what we can about what we can control. And so to say that mindset is important isn't to negate that the realities are terrible, but what anxiety gives us is that extra energy, focus, persistence, creativity all of which are higher correlated with anxiety scientifically. Actually, there's some great studies
Mm-hmm.
out there that have started to look at this. We can only use that to do the best we can in this world, and that's the power of this mindset reset.
Mm-hmm.
And my book is not a very tip laden book because I didn't want to write that. I didn't want to put more tips out in the world because there are wonderful tips out there already. But it's a mindset reset in that sense. And so when we make that distinction, what we can control, what we can't, and then that third step of the 3 L's that I didn't mention, which is to let go, we can't always be working so hard. We
Mm-hmm.
can't always be listening and leveraging, listening and leveraging. You have to binge watch Netflix sometimes, right? But there are great ways to let go that get us in that flow of creativity. And that's how I think about letting go,
Mm-hmm.
immersing ourselves in something that's bigger than us, that we care about, that brings us back to the present. And that can be everything from sports to volunteering and doing something about the climate, to the arts, which are a big one for me, um, to meditation and spirituality. I mean, I think that we're having a reckoning right now with how moreless we feel, utterless rather, in terms of what we believe in and wanting to believe in something and wanting to connect with something bigger than ourselves. For some people, that will be spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that that's how we let go after we've listened and leveraged. Not avoid, but let go and immerse ourselves in these really important things that we can do in the world. And anxiety helps us, it's our ally in that.
Thank you for that. Um, all right. So, we've spoken a lot about a lot. Uh, I'm just curious, take home messages that you want people to know about your work that can help them starting today. I like your 3 L's. I like,
Yeah, think about the 3 L's. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'd say consider those 3 L's because we have all the tips, but that's like putting gas in your tank of your car and having no road to drive on. So the 3 L's is just like a little map of the territory. So think about those 3 L's, starting with listening, right? Even if you have to, um, you don't always know what anxiety is telling you at first. It will reveal itself. That's one thing. The other thing is people get a little PO'd at me sometimes because they're like, "You keep on praising anxiety. Anxiety sucks. Anxiety sucks," and it is so painful in so many ways. So I'm not telling you to love your anxiety. I'm not even telling you to like it. But I believe we need to honor our anxiety as a crucial, essential part of being human. It is a feature, not a bug.
nice.
And when we do honor it, we will be more prepared to do whatever this uncertain 21st century throws our way. And our kids will be too. And so that's really the thought that I'd like to leave people with.
Thank you. All right. So I always like to wrap up by asking you to imagine a world
Hmm.
where people have a new relationship with anxiety and people understand that anxiety has very important information in it for us that helps us to be the people we want to be, achieve the things we want to achieve, not just make us feel suffocated.
Mhm.
So, what will be different in that world?
I think we adults would talk to kids differently about anxiety. I once had a middle schooler, I was talking about anxiety. Kids get it faster than adults every single time, as you know. And she said, adults act like they should be taking away my anxiety. She said, can they? And then she said, should they? And no was the answer. So I think we would talk differently to kids. We'd see anxiety as an opportunity. We'd see it as a sign of doing hard things. And we wouldn't feel like we had to bubble wrap kids against it, that rather we would, comfort. Of course we can give people comfort, but we would make kids feel that it's safe to feel anxiety. That would be a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we would also help kids and ourselves believe that anxiety was a part of being excellent, and it's, not in a way that I have to be anxious to get things done, but rather I have to make mistakes. I have to jump in. It's like productive struggle in education. You might have heard of that term. This
Mm-hmm.
idea that the deepest learning is when we don't explain steps to people XYZ, right? But rather We allow people to jump in and be uncertain and figure it out and then loop back for help when they need it. I see a world in which we think of emotions as in that exact same way, that we have to allow people to productively struggle to be their fullest selves and to cope well with those feelings. I never want someone to say, "Oh, you're anxious. Okay, oh, let me here. Make sure you better do something about that." Instead, when people say, "I'm anxious," I want our response reflexively to be, "Good, me too." Now, what do we do with it?
Mm-hmm.
So we're all born anxious. That's kind of the world I see. And if we shifted that, we'd see. I just think we'd feel. It's sort of like the improv technique of yes and. I think we'd see those difficult emotions. We'd say yes to it in some level that we could in that moment, and we'd just be able to spin it forward into something more amazing for ourselves. That's the world. If we can even just start having those conversations to change the dialogue like that, that's the world I'd really love to see, because everything will follow, I think, in better ways.
Awesome. Tracy, thank you so much. I just love this conversation.
Oh, me too, Mark. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Yeah.
This was fun.